Okay.
Thank you. Okay, today will be a much more brief or briefer? Which is it? More brief. Briefer.
A much more brief.
Today's lecture will be, in comparison, brief.
I don't think brief is real.
It shouldn't take us too long. My intention was to start chapter 15 today, but I want to finish 14 and I have pedigree practice problems, which are associated with what we're going to talk about in just a second, that you will work on after we chit chat. And what my plan is then is on Thursday Thursday I might talk to y'all for quite a while up here, but I want to cover basically the fundamentals of chapter 15 and kind of be done with it. Next week we meet 3 times and it'll be like 2 lab activities with some test review, and then the test is Friday of next week. So it's coming up pretty soon.
Friday of next week.
Friday of next week, yeah, not this
Sick.
week. The last school day of January 2021. We're already through this month,
Wait.
you know,
oh,
by the end of next week. So- Today is primarily focused on pedigrees, which you can see drawn out here, and on the next slide I will have another pedigree that's got a little less information, and we're going to use the pedigree to ascertain information about a trait. And that's the purpose of them, basically, is to try to find patterns of inheritance for a specific trait. Now, there are 2 traits that are shown up here, so they have 2 different pedigrees. I'm moving slow this morning mentally. And we actually have real sisters that apparently have different genetic traits that work in the simplest Mendelian ways, where it's just one gene pair with some combination of either the dominant or recessive alleles for that trait, okay? Now, we haven't talked about these specifically, but there's something called a widow's peak. I actually don't know if I have one, because it's where the hair at the front of your forehead here, or the top, makes a little bit of an angled pattern versus not having that bit of hair growth in that pattern. That is based on a dominant or recessive genotype. That phenotype is. There is also a special chemical, or a specific chemical that's abbreviated PTC, I can't think of the name of it, but you can put that chemical on some paper and you can taste it. You can basically put the paper to your tongue, and some people do not taste anything, and some people get kind of this gross taste from it. It's some sort of sulfur-based chemical, and it actually can kind of tie back to certain foods that have sulfury chemicals within them that people either don't mind eating or dislike eating. And honestly, similar things are probably going on when, if there's a certain food you don't like. Personally, one of the most foul tastes of any common food item for me is the cucumber. Whereas most people, when I tell them I hate cucumbers, are like, cucumbers don't taste like anything. They're just a refreshing, crunchy treat. I can tell if there was cucumber on a salad and then you pick the cucumber off, I can taste the chemical trail and it makes me feel sick. I hate the flavor of cucumber.
So that doesn't mean that there's a thing called an acquired taste. Or actually, it's the reverse.
It's a good
Because
point,
it's
though.
genetically related to the taster.
I don't know if that is a genetic trait that I just described with the cucumber, and not all tastes are going to have some sort of dominant recessive gene pair that determines it.
But it explains why certain people like certain foods.
It certainly does explain why some people don't like some foods. That is absolutely correct. But there are some things that, for instance, when I was a kid, my mom would always make sauerkraut, like homemade sauerkraut. I thought it was disgusting. But now that I'm older, sauerkraut is one of my favorite foods. I love sauerkraut. So there is an acquired taste that happens. And I think a lot of it might just be as you get older, your tongue just
Are you sure that
isn't as sensitive anymore.
Are you sure that isn't the biggest lie you've ever told? The sauerkraut?
Yes, I really like sauerkraut. I mean, it might not be one of my
That is my
favorite.
least
It's one of my favorite garnishes. All right, so getting back to pedigrees, what are we looking at here? What are the squares and circles?
Squares are male, circles are female.
That's right. These are people, or, these don't have to be done on humans. You can fill out a pedigree for any sexually reproducing organism. But in this specific case, at least, and typically, it's males and females. Now, the shaded individuals, and this is a little bit weird, even though it's a very simple idea, the shaded individuals have the trait in question. Okay? So if you're talking about any trait, eye or skin color, widow's peak, tasting this PTC paper, lactose intolerance, whatever it may be, any trait with a genetic component, when you are talking about that trait, people with it are going to be shaded, and then people that do not show that specific phenotype are unshaded. What does the line connecting to people mean with the line descending from it?
They're not offspring. They're pairs.
They're mated pairs that have children. So these two individuals had a daughter and 3 sons. And usually reading from left to right, it would be oldest to youngest. And then this son did what? Had kids with this woman. So we have like P1, F1, and F2. Or sometimes we just say the P generation, F1, F2. And we've actually linked another family here, and that's where we have these two individuals in question. So that in general is what is going on. Now, in this pedigree, they've written out all the genotypes already for you, and in some cases we don't know for sure. For instance, this woman right here could be either genotype. All we know is she's exhibiting the dominant trait. But we don't know if she got a dominant allele from each parent or if she got a recessive from one parent or the other. We do not know that. We just know she got one of her parents' dominant traits or dominant alleles for this trait. Okay. A few things. Not every time you have a shaded trait will it be dominant or recessive. So in this case, the shaded trait in question happens to be a trait controlled by a dominant allele. In this question, the shaded trait here is controlled by the recessive allele. So don't get in any kind of bad habits where if something's shaded, you just assume it's recessive. A lot of times it is. Usually recessive traits do appear less often because the dominant genes typically will cover them up when you have a heterozygous situation. And it's usually the kind of rare trait that you're trying to track, or the less commonly seen trait that you're trying to track. So a lot of times we do find that pedigrees, the shaded trait is recessive, but that's not always the case. Not always the case. So let's look at this pedigree right here. Let's pretend, and we're going to practice this on the next slide, let's pretend these genotypes were not shown. Okay? We don't know big T, little t, or little t, little t. And you just saw this pedigree with the shapes and the shades. And that's it. What mating, what parent-child or parents and children connection can you point to that proves that in this pedigree the shaded trait is recessive? Is there something you can point out? What would we look to and say, there, that tells me shaded is definitely a homozygous recessive condition?
Like every single one that's shaded is homozygous recessive, so I mean,
Well, but if we didn't know that, there is a mating. So there's only 3 examples in this pedigree where people are having kids. These 2 individuals had kids. These 2 individuals had kids, and these 2 individuals had kids. And now that I look at it, there's actually 2 of those 3 are proof that it's a recessive trait. Don't overthink this. I mean, it's not super easy, but once you see it, I think you'll get it. So, I'm glad you pointed this one out. These parents don't really tell us. Here, somebody has it, somebody doesn't have it, and they have a kid that has it and a kid that doesn't have it. So, thank you for pointing that out. This doesn't really tell us anything. Why do these parents and these parents tell me that the shaded is definitely recessive? Because these parents and these parents they don't have it. So the trait is not seen in these parents. Parents don't have it, but some kids do. That means this gene or this trait in these shaded kids was hiding. What's the only way a trait can hide? If it's recessive. Right. So that's what you want to look for on pedigrees. You want to find parents that don't have it, but a kid that does. If you can find that on a pedigree, that tells you that kid has a recessive trait. Parents don't have it, the kid does. That kid has the recessive trait. That trait is recessive. So that's going to be like the number one trick for reading a pedigree. Find parents that have a child that's different. What makes that child different? You would assume is going to be some sort of recessive gene that, by the way, both parents had to have. So here's another little lesson that will help you fill in a pedigree. If these kids, or this kid, or this kid, any shaded kid, now that we've determined that the trait is recessive, any shaded kid would have like little t, or little a, or whatever letter you're using. For a recessive individual to be homozygous recessive, you have to have a recessive gene from one parent and a recessive gene given by the other parent as well. So these two parents are dominant. They had a recessive kid, but that means each of these dominant parents had to be carrying a recessive gene. So they're definitely heterozygous. So the only way you're going to have a homozygous recessive child is if both parents are heterozygous, assuming the parents aren't showing the trait. Now, of course, in this case, this parent, we see the trait, and so of course that parent's going to give the allele for that trait onto their child. Now, it brings up another point. This child right here, well, this daughter has not had children of her own yet. So, until that happens, or unless you actually do like a molecular test and get a blood sample and look at the DNA itself, which we have been able to do for 30 years now. But with a pedigree, we can't say whether this person is homozygous dominant or shows the dominant phenotype because they're heterozygous. So they have this like this or this possibility. So you run into that. We don't know about her. Both parents could have given their dominant alleles. One parent definitely gave a dominant allele because she shows the dominant phenotype, but the other parent could have given a recessive or not. It's a 50-50 guess. We won't know unless this individual has kids, and even then, you would be looking for what? If this individual had children, what child would definitely confirm? What kind of child would definitely confirm one or the other? This individual, we don't know yet. But if she has a recessive kid, that means she's which one? Heterozygous, big T, little t. So the only way to ever make this determination here with a pedigree, only using a pedigree, is if she has kids, one of them's recessive, and then you know that she gave a recessive gene to that child, which means she's carrying, or heterozygous. So in this one over here, we have two parents that have the trait, a child that does not. So this child is recessive, and so the shaded is dominant. Same trick we just used. But when you're dominant and you don't have kids, you can't tell from a pedigree how you're dominant. Homozygous dominant, heterozygous. But of course, since these parents had a child that was recessive, we know they're heterozygous. So sometimes a person has to have children, and one of those children has to be recessive before you can go back and make a certain assertion about that individual. So you're going to see a lot of this, usually without names. This is from your book on like a practice question they have. And what I typically would do is, instead of names, we just do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I just say, look at individual 14. What is their genotype? Or can you tell their genotype? Those are the kinds of questions you'll see. So, shaded trait, dominant or recessive? It's recessive. Now, if you said it's recessive because it doesn't show up as much, I don't want you to do that. How do you know this shaded is recessive? Yes! Carmen and Miguel did not have the trait, but Carlota did. Exactly.
I've never heard that name before.
Say again?
Carlota.
I couldn't hear you.
I've never heard that name before.
Oh, I have not either. That is actually the only part of this pedigree, I think, that tells you for sure. If it wasn't for these two individuals having a child that was different from either of them, like if we left that out and just looked up here, I could make an argument that the shaded could be dominant, and I could make an argument that the shaded could be recessive. But once you have this, you know that what this child is carrying genetically is hiding, and the only kind of allele that can hide is the recessive allele. So that's how you want to think about this. The last slide, and then I will stop because I promised it would be shorter today, is a condition called achondroplasia, or a type of dwarfism in humans that is controlled by a dominant allele. So this is a simple Mendelian trait. It just simply works with one gene pair that's either dominant, recessive, and some combination. When you have this trait, you are not producing the proper amount or the normal amount of human growth hormone, which actually causes your bones to stretch and elongate. The more you secrete when you're younger, the taller you grow. If you secrete very low amounts, then you can have growth that is much less prominent than normal. And that is, again, a condition called achondroplasia. That is the technical term for it. I will not ask you about that name specifically. But in the case of dwarfism, this specific type of dwarfism in humans, it is actually caused by a very rare dominant allele. And so here we have an individual that is going to have the dwarfism phenotype. They're heterozygous. We do a Punnett square. All of you in here do not have this phenotype. So you are going to be homozygous recessive for this trait. And this is just a standard Punnett square, 2x2 monohybrid cross. Monohybrid meaning we're just looking at one trait at a time. I almost didn't put this slide up here because we already did all this. This is the exact same thing as purple flowers and white flowers in pea plants. Dominant recessive. But I decided to add it in for one reason. This is a condition that is pretty rare and considered, I don't want to use a term that's not, appropriate or whatever, but it's considered like a disorder. All right? This is not a condition that people are necessarily hoping and praying that their children have. And it's dominant. So what I'm trying to do here on this last slide, before we move on to the last chapter, is one last reminder that dominant and recessive do not mean common or better or worse or, rare. Dominant recessive does not refer to those things. All right? Dominant recessive simply means when you have the two together in a heterozygous individual, the dominant gene is the one that shows up. The recessive gene does not. That's it. Just keep that in mind. On your coursework page for today is a pedigree practice sheet. The end of the practice sheet starts to talk about sex-linked traits on the X and Y chromosomes. We have not talked about how that works genetically yet. That's in chapter 15. So you might not be able to do the entire sheet, but you can try it, and I will have answers posted later. And finally, the key for the incomplete dominant, codominant sheet from last class and the human blood types practice sheet from last class. I have filled out the key. They're up here. I have scanned them and put them on the coursework page under the main resources part. So you can look at the keys for any genetics practice problems we've done already. We have 35, 40 minutes. You have this time to work on whatever. So if you could stop recording for me.